Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's January 1st, 2026, and I have 5 predictions for 2026 that will be evaluated in a year from now. The first prediction is that gold will hit in US dollar denominated valuation $5,000 this year. Something that will coincide with the continued weakening of the dollar and, by extension, the weakening of American imperial, cultural, and military hegemony. But wait, shouldn't this redound to America's benefit? Because officially, America has by far the largest number of gold reserves. According to Gemini, the United States has almost 8,200 tons of gold stored in places like Fort Knox, whereas number 2 is Germany with only 3,300 tons, less than half of what the United States does. But of course, there has not been an audit of American gold reserves for decades, and the presumption is, like just about anything else that has to do with governmental self-reporting, or in this case, total lack of self-reporting, that the nominal number that is put forward does not mesh at all with the real number that exists or doesn't exist in the ground. And so if the American dollar continues to bleed power in terms of its status as the global reserve currency, if it becomes realized definitively at some point that the amount of reserves that the U.S. government has or claims to have doesn't match with what they actually have, then that will create a vicious spiral where the dropping power of the dollar will then plummet precipitously, because the remaining value that should underlie the value of the dollar, which would be those massive gold reserves, if they don't exist, then the problem just becomes perpetuated. When we talk about figures measured in the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars, that's a scale that is difficult for people to grasp, but we're going to do our best anyway to try to get some idea of just how enormous the increase in valuation, in nominal valuation of gold over the last 5 years has been. In 2020, the global market cap of gold was $13 trillion, and now it is over $30 trillion. That is a valuation increase of over 100%, even though the supply over that period of time has grown by around 5 or 6%. So this clearly signifies something major happening, and it doesn't seem to be decelerating. It seems to be accelerating. Here towards the end of 2025, it was especially pronounced. In fact, Tucker Carlson is involved in some sort of gold company of his own, and he had pre-recorded an episode that must have been recorded about 4 months ago, because on the episode he was talking to the person who he's partnering with, and they talked about gold crossing the $3,000 threshold, and by the time they released it, gold was already over $4,000, which in terms of gold movement, just going back to before the turn of, or immediately after the turn of the millennium, so in 2001, 2002, gold ounce value was about $300 an ounce, and now it's measured at being almost $4,500 an ounce, and it grew by a magnitude more than 3 times what its total value was worth less than 25 years ago, just to kind of put the magnitude of the changes into perspective. And it's not as though gold has some sort of inherent value that has grown 10x in the last 20 years. It is the oldest measured form of value exchange in human history. And inherent in that status is a tendency to grow and shrink in value at an almost glacial timescale, very, very modestly over time. Historically, for gold to move by $1,000 an ounce, well, there is no historical precedent for that, because it literally has never happened. And so I think that this is indicative of something seismic happening in terms of the international monetary system.
What about crypto? It's been in a trough recently. Do you think crypto will be a big news story in 2026?
If it is, my prediction is that it will be a continuation of the downward spiral that it's been in here in most of 2025. And I think that is largely a consequence of the leveraging that is going on with companies like Strategy, which is Michael Saylor's company that has effectively just become a Bitcoin repository that has like an average costed purchase of Bitcoin around $75,000 and is highly leveraged in that direction, such that if Bitcoin falls below that percentage, then there could be a run away from what effectively act as Bitcoin holding companies like Strategy, where those stocks get dumped, and then to try to maintain financial stability, these massive Bitcoin repositories are forced, due to their fiduciary duty, to sell the Bitcoin they have because their stock's being sold, and they do that to raise funds, and that causes a vicious cycle where the Bitcoin price continues to decline. Optimistically, I would love to see the promise of cryptocurrencies be realized, but we're in the second Trump administration, the self-styled Bitcoin presidency, and crypto, which mentioned the market cap of gold 5 years ago. At that time, crypto's market cap was around $1 trillion. So it was close to 10% of the valuation, the market cap valuation of gold. And now, having declined, while gold has gone from 13 trillion to 30 trillion, we're looking at 5 years ago, rough estimate, crypto is 10% of gold's market cap valuation, and now it's probably closer to about 2%. And so the sense that I get it is that it was a potential competitor to fiat that was looking like it might be on the precipice of supplanting gold as an alternative to a fiat global currency system, but that it has retreated significantly since that point in time, and gold has reemerged as the time-tested, true antithesis to a fiat dollar system or fiat monetary system, and is now rather inconsequential, at least in terms of understanding the decline in the US dollar's global status as the reserve currency of the world. The next prediction is that Nicolás Maduro and the Venezuelan regime will remain in power, and that the seeming impending attack on Venezuela led by America on the justification that Venezuela is a narco-terrorist state, that will lose steam and end up floundering. As far as the purpose of the saber-rattling, even more than that, moving destroyers and aircraft carriers into position to potentially attack Venezuela, the meta political purpose, as I'm able to assess it, seems to be to dilute the idea that all of the Trump administration's international focus is at the behest of Israel and is obsessed with the Middle East, and that it isn't some global establishment of American military prowess, but instead it is the Trump administration just doing the bidding of Zionism and the MAGA coalition that was a big part of getting Trump elected. Well, given the interventionist parameters that we're operating in, having already provided support for Israel in the attack of the bombing of Iran in 2025, within those parameters, what could be more America first, MAGA infused than a resurrection of the Monroe Doctrine and the idea that the real focus of American foreign policy really is the homeland, and here we have this country that is bringing in drugs that are killing Americans, and we're going to go topple that regime, and in so doing, rehabilitate the idea of American anti-terrorist military might affecting positive changes in a way that isn't just completely aligned with the stated goals of Israel. That is the best thing I can come up with in understanding why Venezuela, of all places, to the response that this is the Trump administration doing a pet project that Marco Rubio is interested in as Secretary of State. Well, that could be the case, but Marco Rubio's family is from Cuba. And so if he is trying to get back at the Castro regime by knocking out a Cuban ally in Venezuela, it would seem like the more direct approach would be to just knock out the government of Cuba. American popular opinion is already more favorably inclined to moving in that direction because there is a decades-long precedent, bipartisan precedent to a large extent, in terms of antagonism towards Cuba that doesn't exist to the same extent towards Venezuela. So unless this is a lot of audacity on the part of the Trump administration thinking that a la the Bush administration 20 years ago, knocking out the Axis powers, the axis of evil powers, and they're going to knock out Venezuela first and then Cuba will be next. Outside of that seemingly absurd ambition, it's hard to make sense of what the purpose of this is, and the Trump administration is not doing a particularly good job at selling it. If we look at the latest Economist YouGov polling on the question of regime change in Venezuela, there is very little popular support for it. In terms of questions about blockading Venezuelan ports, only 35% of U.S. adults support that. 28% of independents and 10% of Democrats do, and just 66% of Republicans. So even 1/3 of Republicans aren't going along with the MAGA foreign policy agenda as it relates to Venezuela. And that 35% of the adult population supporting something in a midterm year that, as we'll get to in a subsequent prediction, it looks like it's shaping up to be a congressional bloodbath for Republicans. To do something that is that unpopular in a year of midterms seems almost politically suicidal. On the even more direct question of force, quote, do you support or oppose the U.S. using military force to overthrow Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro? Just 22% of U.S. adults support it, only 6% of Democrats, 15% of independents, and only 44% of Republicans. And in contrast, 74% of Americans say that if the Trump administration takes any military action in Venezuela, it needs to get congressional approval first. And so this paints a picture of something that is politically extremely unpopular now. And so for something to seem to have very little practical benefit for the second Trump administration's foreign policy goals, paired with the fact that it is politically exceptionally unpopular in a midterm year, leads to the assessment that it is going to be something that the Trump administration is going to drop.
You mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. The Trump administration in November put out a national security strategy, and in the section on the Western Hemisphere, I'm going to read from that as follows. After years of neglect, the United States will reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere and to protect our homeland and our access to key geographies throughout the region. We will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. This Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is a common sense and potent restoration of American power and priorities, consistent with American security interests. Our goals for the Western Hemisphere can be summarized as, quote, enlist and expand, end quote. We will enlist established friends in the hemisphere to control migration, stop drug flows, and strengthen stability and security on land and sea. We will expand by cultivating and strengthening new partners while bolstering our own nation's appeal as the hemisphere's economic and security partner of choice. I can see some of these ideals being realized. There are some more right-wing governments taking power in South America. Most recently, I can think of Chile, who just chose a right-wing, actually a German immigrant to Chile, whose parents were, I believe, associated with the Nazis back in Germany. And he's spoken in the president-elect of Chile has spoken very forcefully about the need to repel the illegal aliens that are flooding into Chile from nearby countries. I believe Honduras is one of the biggest. And so then, of course, you've got Javier Milei in Argentina. You've got Bukele in El Salvador. So there are some good candidates to enlist to assist in those. I think almost all America First supporters would agree with the goals of controlling migration, stopping drug flows, and strengthening stability and security. And so I guess laying out that broader framework, maybe it sheds some light on what the Trump administration is trying to do in Venezuela. If the Trump administration got its way and got that woman who just won the Nobel Peace Prize, if they were able to get her inserted and allow her to assert control over Venezuela, presumably she would be much more pliable in terms of controlling migration and certainly being more friendly to Western companies accessing the natural resources of Venezuela. So I think there is certainly an America First case for intervening in Venezuela that would satisfy the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. However, this ostensible reason for the blowing up these boats is that Venezuela is carrying drugs, specifically fentanyl, to the United States. And from what I have seen, that is largely false, that Venezuela does not produce fentanyl. That comes from the ingredients come from China, and it's mostly assembled in Mexico. And then even if you were to talk about cocaine is largely coming from Colombia, is my understanding. So I don't think the stated reason is passing the smell test, and maybe that accounts for the low support, or at least helps account for the low support that Americans have for what the Trump administration is doing with Maduro.
Right. It's ridiculous on its face to permit the current Mexican regime to go on unmolested on the pretense that this is an action primarily driven by a war against drug smuggling, to go down and knock out Venezuela but leave Mexico untouched is obviously absurd to even casual observers. Additionally, in terms of how this ties into immigration into the United States, the connection between Venezuela and illegal migration in America is very tenuous indeed, for good reason, because the number of illegals estimated in the United States who have a country of origin of Venezuela these numbers are from the Migration Policy Institute, which is a pro-immigration international institute that measures population flows throughout the world. It is estimated that a little under 500,000 illegal or undocumented, as they would state it, Venezuelans are in the United States, compared to over 5 million Mexicans. So in terms of measuring the entire illegal alien population in the United States, 4% are estimated to come from Venezuela, whereas 40% come from Mexico. And even though there have been some high-profile gang-related instances of Venezuelan migrants causing problems in America, the problem of illegal immigration in America is still overwhelmingly associated, for good reason, with migration from Mexico rather than from Venezuela. Now, that could conceivably change with a regime change war in Venezuela, toppling the government there and causing people to leave Venezuela and stream out north towards the United States, or even to some of the other potential budding allies that Jeff mentioned, say, Venezuelans heading west to Chile or Argentina. So that is probably another factor as to why, despite the fact that this seems to be a priority of the Trump administration, that a lot of MAGA voters are unsure of or unwilling to lend their support to this, because on a lot of different axes, it just doesn't feel inherently like a MAGA America First thing to be involved in. I'm glad Jeff mentioned the national security strategy document that the Trump administration released. He had prodded me to read it, and I was derelict in so doing, but it looks like I kind of grokked the general idea politically of what the Trump administration is trying to do with that by reorienting the focus in terms of categorizing military intervention in the Western Hemisphere as being something that is MAGA, and by extension, then lending more support for military adventurism in other places.
A little bit of a detour since I brought up the national security strategy. The section on Europe is perhaps the most interesting, and I'm going to quote from it. The larger issues facing Europe include activities of the European Union and other transnational bodies that undermine political liberty and sovereignty, migration policies that are transforming the continent and creating strife, censorship of free speech and suppression of political opposition, cratering birth rates, and loss of national identities and self-confidence. Should present trends continue, the continent will be unrecognizable in 20 years or less. As such, it is far from obvious whether certain European countries will have economies and militaries strong enough to remain reliable allies. Many of these nations are currently doubling down on their present path. We want Europe to remain European, to regain its civilizational self-confidence, and to abandon its failed focus on regulatory suffocation. Now, notably, the word race or white is never mentioned, but I think this is about as close as you can get to saying we want Europe to remain white as you can get without saying it directly. And the reference, at least the reference I thought of, is about political suppression is specifically to the Alternative for Deutschland or Alternative for Germany, AfD, that party that has, in certain eastern states in Germany, has achieved high levels of vote. I think they're the most popular party in some states in Germany, and their profile is continuing to grow. They are, I think by some measures, the second most popular party in Germany, and yet it is designated by the state German federal apparatus as essentially a terrorist organization, and its leaders are surveilled, and these same countries that speak so sanctimoniously about democracy are literally using the apparatus of the state to suppress and undermine the second most popular political party in Germany.
Yeah, rhetorically, that's pretty bold, the idea of making Europe European again. That would have a corollary here with making America American again, which, while not explicitly racial, as Jeff mentioned, would be perceived as being even more problematic by the managerial state than the slogan, Make America Great Again, is. The cynical side, of course, is that while this is going on, the administration is simultaneously advocating for even more high-tech visa migration from the other side, from outside the Western Hemisphere, from the other side of the world. And so if the call is for Europe to become European again, it's hard to see how massive high-tech migration from the Indian subcontinent would make America American again. The third prediction for 2026 is one that, as Steve Saylor is fond of saying, it is a prediction that is not very risky because it is almost certain to be realized to be an accurate prediction, and those kind of predictions, the ones that are drearily predictable but don't make people feel good, are the ones that people are least interested in, whereas predictions that are much more difficult that are approximate a coin flip are ones that people get all excited and interested in. So the prediction of who will win the Super Bowl or something will have people talking animated discussions forever. But the prediction that we're making here, that fertility, the total fertility rate in every single state in the United States will decline when the final numbers come out in 2025 from 2024, isn't particularly interesting, even though it is quite important in terms of understanding the future trajectory of the United States. It is not exciting because from 2020 to 2024, for those 5 years, in literally every single state in the country, every single year, fertility dropped in all of those states. And in all of those states, and of course, in the country as a whole, fertility is already below replacement and continues to decline and will continue to decline. The fourth prediction, not unrelated to the prediction about $5,000 gold and the corresponding decline in the purchasing power of the American dollar, and also related to the predicted failure of the second Trump administration to execute a regime change in Venezuela, is an impending midterm congressional blowout, particularly in the House. I think actually in the Senate that Republicans are likely to maintain control of the Senate simply because the way that this set of 1/3 of senators being elected happens to fall, they are overwhelmingly in red states where outside of Susan Collins in Maine, there are not really any elections that look like they're going to be competitive for Republicans in the Senate. If the GOP does lose the Senate, given the states that are up for re-election, it will be a congressional bloodbath that is even more severe than we're predicting, or that I'm predicting here. But I think in the House, given the public polling that we've looked at, the last few recordings that have been mentioned in terms of generic congressional ballots and the advantage that Democrats are showing, I don't see a likelihood of that gap narrowing anytime between now and November of 2026, and suspect, to the contrast, that it will continue to grow, that will correlate to around a 20 to 25 seat majority for Democrats in the next Congress, and that will effectively spell the end of the second Trump administration's ability to do anything beyond just political messaging and foreign policy actions. But in terms of a domestic agenda, it will come to resemble the second half of the first Trump administration, where it is entirely bogged down with proceedings about impeachment and accusations of illegality and corruption and the like, and it will turn into the same sort of circus that characterized 2019 and 2020.
Regarding immigration, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act gave massive infusion of cash to fund immigration and customs enforcement. So presumably that cash will continue to flow into 2026 and 27. And so even if the Democrats were to take control of the House in early 2027, the Trump administration would still have the legislative authority, which they've always had. Any administration has always had the legislative authority to enforce immigration law and to deport illegal aliens. They'll have that, but they'll also have the resources to hire ICE officers and to implement those immigration enforcement actions. And I don't think that would necessarily change if the Democrats got control of the House. I'm not sure how they would effectively be able to stop him.
Well, if the federal government at that time continues to be funded by continuing resolutions, the spending, all of that spending originates in the House. So conceivably, they could cut that allocation of funds off. But I think more cynically, while it would possibly mean the continuation of an effective sealed border in terms of no new illegal or trivial amounts of illegal immigration continuing into America during the last 2 years of the Trump administration. The funding is already there, and the mass deportations that were promised and will be necessary to do anything other than just have the second Trump administration serve as a momentary blip on the continuing illegal migration into the United States without effectively removing the tens of millions of illegal aliens already here, that if that's not happening now, when Republicans control both houses and have the congressional authority and the funding to execute deportations, that they would then find that resolve in the flurry, in the midst of focusing on impeachment and the circus that will entail seems unlikely. And the last prediction is one anticipated to actually not be realized. And so it is a prediction since we got a freebie by predicting the obvious, that fertility will continue to decline in every state in the United States in 2025 and in 2026 as those numbers come out next year. This is the predicted, or at least aspirationally hoped for, universes beyond fusion of the Dragon Quest series with Magic the Gathering in 2025. Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, the parent company, did a joint release of Magic the Gathering and Final Fantasy. That was the most successful set that the company has ever had by leaps and bounds. And while Final Fantasy is the best known Japanese role-playing game series in the United States, it is second fiddle to Dragon Quest in Japan. And while Pokemon is by far the biggest card game in Japan, the dominance that it has in America is much more muted because Magic the Gathering is much more popular in the United States than it is in Japan. And so we have a card game opportunity for Magic to get into the Japanese market, and there is the opportunity, conversely, for Magic to take advantage of Dragon Quest's popularity in Japan to break through the trading card game market in Japan by riding the coattails of Dragon Quest. As far as why that is a prediction that is perceived long shot, is because Dragon Quest is a very valuable IP in Japan, and so the amount that Square Enix, the parent company of Dragon Quest, would demand to make that IP available to Hasbro, and the expected return that Hasbro could hopefully garner from having a release of an IP that is not particularly popular in the West, just to try to shore up a weak market in Japan, the ask might be too high for what the bid Hasbro would be willing to make is. But Jeff, who has a much better finger on the pulse of gaming everywhere, in the United States in particular, says that Dragon Quest has seemed, his sense is that it has become more popular in the West. And so there could be mutual benefit here where Hasbro gets penetration into the trading card game market in Japan, and Square Enix gets greater penetration in the American market for Dragon Quest. Here's to hoping, anyway, that if I lose my civilization, I at least get to optimize the recreational nerding, frittering away of time. To briefly recapitulate those 5 predictions: $5,000 gold, Maduro staying in power, fertility continuing to drop, Republicans experiencing a congressional bloodbath in November of 2026, and Hasbro tapping the Dragon Quest IP. As far as a white and black pill encapsulation of 2025, the white pill is that much of Conservatism Inc. in 2025 going into 2026 sounds indistinguishable from American Renaissance or VDARE from 2015. In a lot of ways, people like Matt Walsh are more extreme than anything that would have been written on VDARE a decade ago. And VDARE was a shoestring operation that was effectively destroyed by the Attorney General of New York effecting lawfare against the organization, and yet randomly opening up X under Elon Musk's leadership and ownership. One is likely to find, again, things that are more, quote, controversial, unquote, than anything that would have been written VDARE a decade ago. And so the white pill there is rhetorically that effectively the dissident right has won their rhetorical war. You can see that too with the popularity and seeming begrudging acceptance of somebody like Nick Fuentes being an accepted mainstream figure on the right and being welcomed on the largest independent media platforms like the aforementioned Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Patrick Bet-David, and if not explicitly corporate media, but corporate media adjacent people like Piers Morgan, who, like Tucker Carlson, had a long history on network corporate media outlets. Take it back to Matt Walsh, who is the figure I'm most familiar with in terms of being inside the corporate media establishment, working for the Daily Wire, in terms of what he says, the kind of content that he talks about. He multiple times, almost habitually, without any fanfare, talks about how Somalians have IQs below 80 and how Somalians' deficit in terms of human capital that can flourish in the West is such that there should be no migration at all from Somalia. And of course, taking those same parameters and looking at migration from much of the rest of the world, the same conclusion could be drawn that effectively there should be close to an immigration moratorium, because if there isn't, then it's going to cause Western civilization to collapse under a flood of dysfunctional third world double-digit inbred clannish migration. And that is a more explicit, less diplomatic way of saying the same sorts of things that Jared Taylor was banished from the entire internet for saying a decade ago. The black pill to all of this is a corollary to that, and it's something we brought up previously with the seeming AFDization of the Republican Party, where while simultaneous to this rhetoric being mainstreamed, there is a corresponding decrease in political popular support, such that the Republican Party starts to, kicking and screaming, starts to sound more and more, and the organizations associated with it, like Turning Point USA, starts to sound more and more like the dissident right or like AfD in Germany. But with that comes a reduction in popular support and an inability to achieve any national positions of power through elections, and instead serves as a convenient Goldstein type of character from 1984, where there is a lot of hate that is able to be directed at the putative party contending for power, but one that can't actually achieve any sort of meaningful national power. And we get something like the PRI in Mexico that had the presidency for something like 90 of 100 years from 1900 to 2000, where we have some sort of continuous and almost uncontested string of Democratic presidential victories and congressional control and all of the consequences that flow from that for Heritage America, or what's left of it.
I'm not going to make predictions per se. I am going to flag some stories that I'm going to be following closely in 2026. So in no particular order, the continuing fallout from the Charlie Kirk assassination, so specifically the criminal trial that's scheduled to kick into gear in Provo, Utah, the defendant being Tyler Robinson, the putative murderer of Charlie Kirk. There has actually been some development in the last week or so. They've been ruling on certain pretrial motions regarding the ability of the media to have access to the trial, and the whether the defendant can be pictured wearing shackles, things of that nature. So it's more procedural, but the trial is supposed to begin, I believe, in earnest sometime in mid-2026. So that's definitely something we'll continue to follow. And then generally, too, how Turning Point handles things going forward. We have been highly critical of how Turning Point has handled the situation since Charlie Kirk was killed, and more recently, we've been critical of Erica Kirk's leadership. So it'll be interesting to see where Turning Point goes in 2026. And Ness mentioned the 2026 midterm elections. That's certainly something we'll be following. Another story we'll be following is the Carmelo Anthony criminal trial, which is scheduled to begin sometime in 2026. That is the black 18-year-old who is accused of murdering a white, I believe he's also 18 or 17, Austin Metcalf in Frisco, Texas, a suburb of Dallas. It'll be interesting see where that trial goes. Also, we'll be watching the Mamdani administration. So we've talked a lot about Zohran Mamdani and a lot about his background as a market-dominant minority. And we're recording this on January 1st, 2026. He formally was sworn in as the mayor, I believe, at midnight today. So he's been mayor for almost 24 hours. And he was sworn in by Letitia James, the Attorney General of the state of New York. And AOC and Bernie Sanders were present at the inauguration. And Zohran Mamdani gave Bernie Sanders a shout out during his in his inaugural address, whatever the proper term is. And he has, of course, made a lot of promises. Many of them, they cost millions and millions of dollars and would require increase in taxation and apparently specifically taxing corporations. And I guess in New York, the only way to do that is to get approval of the New York State legislature and the governor. And so it'll be interesting to see if Mamdani is able to carry out any of his lofty promises. I suspect that he's also promising free child care for everyone, and he's promising to freeze rents, but only a minority of apartments in New York City are even eligible to have their rent frozen. So I am skeptical, to say the least, that he's going to be able to achieve any of his lofty promises. I also suspect that crime will go up. He has kept in the same police commissioner that Eric Adams has, so that could be perhaps a signal that he's not going to disrupt law enforcement as much as maybe he was promising during the campaign, and maybe a far cry from 2020 Zohran Mamdani when he was calling for defunding the police.
In the spirit of the repeated emphasis on location, and the necessity of separating disparate peoples and cultures geographically to correspond with all of the other sorts of separations that need to take place in the demographic age that we're entering, I wholeheartedly, emphatically, vociferously hope that Mamdani succeeds beyond his wildest dreams in terms of all of the promises that he campaigned on in 2025. And I hope he is as bold as he can be and doesn't backslide towards corporate Democratic party politics as usual, but instead is the sort of political radical that he garnered so much support for being.
I'll also be paying close attention to the Emmanuel Macron defamation lawsuit filed against Candace Owens. That is also, unless it's settled, I believe that is scheduled to go to trial in 2026 as well. And lastly, but certainly not least, the story I will be following most closely is all things relating to immigration in the United States, specifically the Trump administration's mass deportations or lack thereof. So a recent news article shed some light on this. This is from Bloomberg, December 29th. Headline, Trump slammed by heritage hardliner over, quote, fake, end quote, deportations. The Trump administration's focus on deporting immigrants with criminal records, quote, the worst of the worst in its words, is too narrow, said Mike Howell, a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He's pushing for large-scale workplace raids to drive deportations much higher. And that is, Heritage laid out its roadmap for mass deportations in its Project 2025 report, and that served as a guide for much of the Trump's first year back in office. And it's a vision that has been championed by Trump advisor Stephen Miller, who's one of the most influential figures in the White House, and Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. The Howell's critique highlights a growing tension inside Trump's coalition, how to pursue aggressive immigration enforcement without undermining the economy ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. The White House has touted increased arrests and a sharp decline in illegal border crossings as evidence of success, but deportations haven't surged to the level many within the Trump administration expected, constrained by court rulings, detention capacity, and resistance from some nations that receive deportees. A lot of Trump supporters, I think, were somewhat sympathetic to to mass deportations not occurring as many hoped. I think there was some recognition that Trump just stopping the flow of illegal aliens was a huge accomplishment in and of itself. And so while the deportation numbers are nowhere near what the hardcore MAGA people want, there is a recognition that it might take a while to get everything into place and get all the resources allocated and to get everything in place that's needed to actually carry them out. So I think that leniency or that sympathy or that goodwill is not going to last if the mass deportations don't occur in 2026, because at this point there's really not much excuse for the Trump administration not to carry them out. They have the ICE funding, they have all their people in place, they have they have a year of experience, they know the board, and if they're not able to carry out mass deportations, then that's going to be, I think, the end of the Trump administration.
They have the same access to polling, or probably better access to polling, and the same betting markets information that we have access to as well, that presages that congressional bloodbath that we were talking about less than 12 months down the line. And so they know that the clock is ticking. And so if there is going to be a serious effort, it has to be executed post haste, because if it's not, it might as well be as though they never tried in the first place.
Agreed.
Speaking of that polling that the Trump administration has access to, just this week, The Economist YouGov released a poll where one of the questions was, quote, which comes closest to your view about illegal immigrants who are living in the U.S., unquote. And one of the answers is that they should be required to leave the United States. The other two are allowed to stay in the U.S. and eventually apply for citizenship, which received a plurality of responses, allowed to stay in the U.S. but not become citizens, and then required to leave the United States or not sure. Just 37% of respondents said that illegal immigrants should be required to leave the U.S. And of course, that means those who are breaking the law should be punished for breaking the law by being removed from the country, since they aren't authorized to be here in the first place. So that is a bit of a black pill in terms of this being one of the signature issues that propelled the Trump administration to a second administration that just barely over 1 in 3 Americans wants illegal aliens deported. Among Democrats, only 7% want them deported, and among independents, 33%. And so this is likely to be an issue in the midterms, where there will be a lot of pulling on heartstrings about this being the Gestapo going around and trying to round people up and send them back to the places that they came from at gunpoint and how that's not who we are and how we're breaking up families and how it's so harsh and authoritarian and all of these sorts of things. That is going to be a part of the 2026 campaign. And so it's going to be perceived as a repudiation of the Trump administration's orientation towards illegal immigration removal and immigration enforcement more generally if Republicans lose big in 2026. And so that seems to imply that the time frame is even more condensed, where the Trump administration needs to get to the significant deportations pronto, and the consequences of that there needs to be time for the consequences of that to be absorbed by the population. And with 10 months and counting, that seems like quite the feat to pull off if they are able to do it. Here's to hoping that they do, but expecting that they don't. And also somewhat blackpilling, we talked a little bit about the AFDization of the Republican Party and young groypers like Nick Fuentes, who have made a centerpiece of what they talk about, immigration enforcement and demographic stability. And yet if we look at this same poll by age group among those under the age of 30, so Zoomers, just 21% say that illegal aliens should be required to leave the United States. Among millennials, those aged 30 to 44, it's 35%. Among Xers, aged 45 to 64, 45%. And among boomers, 44%. So among older Americans, about half want illegal aliens out of the country. But among those under the age of 45, it's less than 1 in 3. And that is even though presumably younger Americans with more restricted job prospects and more potentially to lose from illegal immigration into the United States are less supportive of enforcing laws against that illegal immigration. Somewhat relatedly, Black Americans presumably have the most to lose. It's often conceived of this way anyway, including by people like Jared Taylor, who we mentioned previously, that Blacks have presumably the most to lose from unabated illegal immigration, and yet this poll shows that just 14% of Blacks think that illegal aliens should be required to leave the United States. That's compared to 44% of whites and even 22% of Hispanics. So about 50%, Hispanics are about 50% more likely to say that illegal aliens should leave the United States than Black Americans are. And on that happy note, we'll sign off for this week. Thanks for listening. Happy New Year. We'll talk to you next time.